Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last month, the Rajya Sabha gave approval to a bill that has now effectively put an end to India's booming real money gaming industry, which was projected to be a $9 billion market in the coming 4 years.
Those in favor will please say aye. Those against will please say no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Clause 16 is adopted. Clause 17 is...
This law proposes sweeping bans along with strict penalties for both platforms and celebrities who promote such games, which experts say encourage compulsive and addictive behavior, often pushing people into financial ruin. So today on the show, we'll discuss how the online gaming industry had grown over the past few years, what this law means for it, and finally the dangers of gambling addiction and how to address them. And for this, we begin with the Indian Express's Soumyarendra Barik, who has been reporting on this sector for the paper. Soumyarendra, why don't you begin by telling us what exactly this act does and what kind of games and companies come under it?
Okay, I think right from the name itself, it's called the Promotion and Regulation of Online Gaming Act 2025. But it's a bit of a misleading name because what the bill comprehensively does is actually the banning of online money gaming, which, the title would kind of mislead you because it looks like it's trying to promote the online gaming ecosystem, which like a couple of the sectors that it's focusing on, like for instance, esports and online social games, which is a new category the government is trying to create. It of course promotes and regulates those, but more importantly, and why the bill or rather the act now is getting discussed in so much detail and, is receiving all kinds of reception essentially, like positive, negative, etc., is because of its very crucial move that it's going to ban all forms of online money gaming.
हम देश के अंदर रोज आत्महत्याओं को देखते हैं, सुसाइड को देखते हैं, परिवारों को बर्बाद होते देखते हैं. इस तरीके का विधेयक लाना और उस पे सदन में आपके विचार, आपके सुझाव वो अवगत करना अच्छा है और मेरे को लगता है इसमें सारा सदन एक मत है और इसीलिए इस कानून को लाया जा रहा है. कुछ कमियां हैं.
So essentially any company or any platform etc. which makes available an online gaming platform would basically fall afoul of this rules basically. And there is a criminal part to it where if you are caught doing like whatever, promoting or advertising these kind of games, you could be jailed for up to 3 years and penalized up to 1 crore. Not just that, even like, because we'd seen on platforms like Instagram and YouTube, etc., a lot of the content creators, particularly we saw, they used to advertise many of these money gaming platforms. So, it also kind of tightens the noose on them saying that, any endorsement of these platforms as well is also, a criminal offense with a jail term of for 2 years or a penalty of 50 lakh or, it could be both.
सुपर आ चुका है भाई. स्टार्टिंग में ही कितना ज्यादा अच्छा खासा मेरा फायदा हो गया भाई. तुम लोग देखो, बस मैंने अभी गेम प्ले करना स्टार्ट किया, अभी 2 मिनट भी नहीं हुआ और कितना ज्यादा मेरा फायदा होना स्टार्ट हो गया. तो आगे आगे गाइस और भी ज्यादा मस्त गेम प्ले होने वाला. फिलहाल के लिए यहाँ पर देखो मेरा मेगा इस बार भी आ गया, जिसमें कि मैंने काफी ज्यादा अच्छे तरीके से इस बार फायदा कर लिया.
And I think the third thing, which is probably one of the most important things that the government is trying to crack down on, is, the underlying payments infrastructure that these companies used to rely on. These are all online-based services. So you transact using your UPI through bank gateway or a payment gateway, etc. So the government has also prohibited banks and financial institutions from facilitating, transactions on these platforms. So in effect, like, the creation of such games, the distribution of such games, the endorsement of such games and facilitating any kind of financial transactions on top of these games is all now outlawed, and with on top of that sort of criminal penalties. It's essentially a criminal offense, right? And one of the more important things that the act does is that it finishes any distinction that had gotten created in India about what is a game of skill and what's a game of chance. It doesn't distinguish between the two. It just simply says that if you are an online gaming service, it doesn't matter if you're a game of skill or a game of chance. It's not kosher essentially.
Right. For instance, a lot of gamers would argue that, you can't put every game under one category. There is a spectrum. On one end, there would be games like roulette, which are purely chance-based. There's no skill there. And on the other end, of course, there would be games like chess, which are purely skill-based. And somewhere in the middle would be poker. A lot of people have argued that poker is a game of skill with a lot of chance involved. But you're saying that this act does not make a distinction between these things. As long as money is involved, you'll come under it.
So as long as money is involved in the terms of, you wagering some money in the hopes of making more money on that particular wager. So that's how, like, for instance, like, let's take an example. And, some of the companies, since you'd asked, one of the companies the biggest company, in fact, in the sector, Dream11, which is definitely impacted by this regulation. So, the ideal that, you create a team of whatever the best players, combine the best players between any two given teams that are playing on that particular day. You pick the players that you think are going to work really well. And the argument there was, there is a degree of skill that goes into picking the best people.
Right. There is some analysis involved there.
Yeah, right. There is maybe some thought goes into it, and it's at the end of the day maybe all chance based, because no player at any given day is guaranteed to be like scoring a century or like taking whatever, like a 5-wicket haul, even though that would have been your assumption, thinking that all the conditions are perfect for them, etc. Right. So that is completely gone now, basically, right?
ये है ड्रीम 11, इंडिया का बिगेस्ट स्पोर्ट्स गेम। तो अपनी क्रिकेट नॉलेज से सिलेक्ट करो अपनी टीम और खेलो क्रिकेट दिमाग से। Log on to dream11.com. बनो दिमाग से।
On the other end, of course, like, you have chess, for instance. I mean, of course, chess is an internationally recognized game of skill, one of the most difficult sports to master in the whole world. And since you bring up chess, like something as interesting as, say, chess.com, for instance, right, which is the biggest platform for online chess playing today. When two players sort of match on the platform, they just play a game of chess. And depending on who wins or loses, you kind of, earn or lose your rating points. You can pay chess.com to get like a premium subscription, and that's okay. Right? As long as your game works on a subscription model, and again, the government doesn't feel that it's against the social ethos of this country, etc., which I'm assuming it wouldn't consider chess to be. And yeah, like talking about the middle ground that you said, poker, rummy, many courts, including the Supreme Court, fantasy sports, etc., like Dream11 and all. There was some jurisprudence from multiple courts, including the Supreme Court, saying that this is a game of skill. There is a degree of skill that, people need in order to be successful on these platforms, etc. But yeah, the government, I think, to kind of just, skirt around falling into, getting into that nuanced discussion about what's a game of skill and what's a game of chance, etc. They're like, we don't want to do anything with this argument, or we don't want to get into this discussion, essentially. If you put money with the hopes of making more money from that particular contest, that game is not okay anymore.
And so how exactly is this act defining an online game?
So I think the definition, is very, very expansive. So I'm just quote from the act directly. It says that an online money game is essentially a service which is played by a user by paying fees, depositing money or other stakes in expectation of winning, which entails monetary and other enrichment in return of money or other stakes, but shall not include any esports, right? So essentially what we discussed earlier, right? You wager money, you create a team, and you enter into a particular contest by paying a certain amount of money, and depending on how your team performed on that particular app, you used to have either some winnings or you ended up losing all of your money, right? So all of that is essentially covered. Now, the one distinction that the government creates, and which is where also this promotion bit of the act comes, is on esports, right? So the government has said that esports is great, and we have to sort of develop India as an esports hub in the world, competitive esports, etc. That is, I think, a sector that the government is definitely looking at sort of encouraging more through this particular act.
जो ई स्पोर्ट्स बहुत एक तेजी से उभरता हुआ है, ई स्पोर्ट्स जिसमें खिलाड़ी आपस में कोऑर्डिनेशन करके टीम वर्क करके खेलते हैं, और उसमें भारत की भी बहुत बड़ी पहचान बन रही है। For
instance, if you enter an esports competition and there's a prize money involved, if you win it, etc., that's all fine under this act, right? The government has to recognize that particular thing as an esport. So that is important. But online money game, then what is an online money game? That's very, very well defined. Esports will be more like, as and when things come. Like say chess.com, and there's an online chess tournament that's going on. I'm sure the government will consider that as an esports tournament, a competitive esports tournament, right? So yeah, that's where we are at the definition of online money gaming. And yeah, another thing, since we were speaking about promotion, another key thing that they actually want to promote is, game development, like gaming as an art, which, I think that's another philosophical criticism that many people used to have beyond, of course, the monetary and financial aspects of online money gaming, is that, you call a Dream11 a gaming platform, and that for people who, view games as pieces of art, etc., that for them was very difficult to comprehend, given, it's not a showcase of, the greatest designers that you could have, or, the greatest storyline that you've built around. You're not building like a world like you do in GTA, etc.
Yeah, one of the biggest and most creative aspects of modern day games is storytelling. And yeah, there's very little of that in Dream11, for example.
Absolutely. So, of course, I think those things the government is like, okay, that is something we want to promote, etc. And so, yeah, that's where the promotion part of it kind of comes in.
And Soumyarendra, over the past few years, this sector had really grown, right? Could you just describe what its landscape looked like and since when did we see it proliferate?
So I think certainly like with most things which have to do with like online, COVID, of course, was a big kind of enabler for these platforms. With Jio in 2016, internet connectivity and penetration was already like, reaching like new heights in the country. Then you had UPI, etc. So, payments were facilitated very easily. So that kind of enabled a lot of these digital companies which have to rely, and, with Aadhaar, so the identity, KYC process, etc. Everything, one is able to do everything online essentially.
Yeah, that was the time when people were getting used to paying things online. I mean, before that, people were really wary.
Absolutely. So I think, a lot of these things with UPI, Aadhaar, KYC getting online, of course, with Jio and like the things that followed with connectivity, etc., and how so many more people kind of got access to the internet at much accessible prices, etc. So, of course, the digital space saw a big boom. That's when, like a lot of these platforms also sort of proliferated. And also this particular sector, unlike a lot of startups in India, was, this was amongst the most sort of successful stories, at least financially, of startup India, right? I mean, 3 startups here have a valuation of more than $1 billion. Multiple company after company, you will see, they're not just generating large amounts of money as revenue running into thousands of crores, several thousands of crores, but also like, having a very healthy balance sheet with, profits year after year. And, it was this industry, as per several reports, was projected to be like a $9 billion market in the next 4 to 5 years. And initially, a couple of years ago, the government saw that, these platforms are making money, right? And they are clearly popular. Like people are playing games, which is what supports the revenue figures. So they were like, let's try taxing them, right? So they were brought under the 28% goods and services tax, which of course, they had pushed back on at that point in time.
Online gaming, horse racing and casinos will be taxed. They will be taxed at 28%, each one. And they will be,
I think at that point in time, the thought within the government was that, we don't really know how to kind of figure out, because it's always difficult for governments to, kind of regulate a very new kind of a online entity, to create a law around it, etc. It's often difficult because, usually in a country like India, it's also very uncharted territory, right? So I guess at that point in time, because they could not really figure out how do we regulate these services, because we do need to regulate them, because given how massively they have proliferated. So let's try regulation by taxation, right? That's where the GST came in. But after a certain point in time, it became kind of clear to them that even though they assumed that, placing a higher tax burden on these platforms might make them less lucrative for players, that wasn't really happening, right? I mean, people were still going to these platforms. And of course, I think another reason for that is because these companies are so cash rich, they took the GST hit, right? I mean, you didn't have to pay out of your pocket anything more than what you were paying before the GST regime kicked in, because they were absorbing whatever the differential there was supposed to be, right? Given just how healthy their balance sheets looked. So yeah, they were able to absorb that, and I guess that's when the government realized that, okay, this is clearly not working out. There were some, I think, considerations to kind of, given that the GST revamp is kind of a process in the works at this point in time, there were, I think, some considerations to tax it even higher at a 40% sin tax, quote unquote. But I guess, eventually they decided that maybe regulation by taxation is not the most effective way, given the problems that they were seeing, and they were like, let's just do away with this altogether. And this was certainly like a sunrise sector, right? Like currently with a collective enterprise valuation of over 2 lakh crore. And since we were speaking of GST, since the GST was applicable on them, the collections for the government, kind of shot up significantly.
The revenue from online gaming has increased by 412%. That is, it has reached 6,909 crores. Just for 6 months, I'm giving you the figure. This amount, 6,909 crore, is earned in a period of 6 months.
Okay, so the government was getting a lot of money out of this sector.
They were. So I think some of the internal calculations that they've done is by kind of banning this sector now. Now, of course, there are no collections because they are just simply not of any online money games anymore. So I think the calculation that they've done internally is that it'll be a revenue hit of anywhere between 15,000, 20,000 or maybe like as much as 30,000 crores. And I guess they're okay with that hit. Maybe try and figure out some other sources for that revenue. But yeah, that's the thing. So it's clear, right? I mean, they are ready to take this revenue hit, knowing that 30,000 crore is a significant amount of money, is a significant amount of revenue for the government. I guess they're okay foregoing that because they just see that the problem is that much bigger.
And before we get into the reason why the government is saying they passed this law, could you talk about who were the biggest players in this sector? Was Dream 11 the biggest one?
Dream 11, of course, was the biggest one. Of course, we all know it, not just because many people now played, but also as the main sponsor of the Indian cricket team. And, I think in FY23, if I remember correctly, they had revenues of close to 7,000 crores and maybe like a profit of close to 200 crores.
एक बात बता, तूने आमिर 11 ज्वाइन किया, रणबीर 11 को क्यों नहीं? वो क्या है ना सर, रणबीर कुछ ज्यादा ही हैंडसम है, उसके सामने में थोड़ा फीका पड़ जाता.
Then there's Winzo, right, which is another big company. Again, a profit of more than 300 crores or close to 400 crores somewhere.
अरे ते विंजो ते बबल शूटर खेलो ना, स्ट्रेस तो छुटकारा भी मिलेगा, ते ढेर सारा कैश जितना मौका भी. विंजो ते मजेदार बबल शूटर खेलो, सिर्फ 1.5 मिनट तक सेम कलर दे बबल नु फोड़ो ते हर दिन KTM बाइक्स, आईफोन ते 10 लाख तक कैश जितना मौका पाओ.
So yeah, they were a big contributor to like the overall digital ecosystem. They were big advertisers, they were big spenders. You'd see their ads pretty much at any given point in time that a sporting event was happening, because their offerings were not as restricted to like one medium of sport, right? It was not just cricket. You could do football, you could do, other things, you could create other kinds of teams and things like that. So yeah, their offerings were diverse. So yeah, My 11 Circle, you had players like MPL, then you had players like Pokerbazi on the poker and rummy side, etc.
जो लाइफ में खेलता है वो पोकर भी खेल सकता है. Download now from pokerbazi.com.
This game may be habit forming or financially risky. Play responsibly.
And again, all very successful companies, a majority of them, kind of churning out a profit, which is again very rare for the startup world in India at this point in time.
And apart from the fact that it was easy for a lot of people to get addicted to these kind of games, was it also that the operating costs of these companies weren't that high? Because when you look at, other companies in the tech sector, they do require a lot of capital. But I'm guessing that wasn't a big concern for them?
I don't think so. I mean, of course, I have zero experience developing an app or what it takes to develop an app and run and maintain an app, of course. But yeah, certainly compared to say like other D2C startups or like a food delivery startup, etc., the investment in kind of building that business from one end might not be as high as the other ones, right? It's completely an online offering. And I think what also worked for them on the flip side, and which was also like the predominant sort of narrative in all of their promotional material, is just this hope/promise that you play this and you could win a house, you could win a Mahindra Thar, you could win 3 crore rupees, you could take a vacation to this particular country. So, it was a very transactional medium, of course, with, of course, the marketing being very on your face, saying that, this is something that people make money out of. You have testimonies of people, someone who's made 45 lakhs, someone who's made 50 lakhs, someone who's made 3 crores, etc. But of course, as we all know, those people are far and few between. And I think on that point as well, like one of the biggest concerns the government had was that they started to believe that the way that these companies had built up their algorithms, they were essentially loaded or created against the user, right? Their algorithms were very, very opaque, and they were designed in a way that a majority of the people are not going to, win. As the old saying goes, that the house never loses, right? So I think the government believed that their algorithms were in a way kind of employing a very similar tactic. And they just felt that a lot of people were losing a lot of money.
And so is that primarily the reason the government says that they felt the need for such an act?
That's what they say, that the social ethos and the impact on society, people losing money, people, borrowing or mortgaging their land and homes and just, taking massive financial hits, etc. Which, of course, is a huge problem. We used to see news reports very often, I hope not anymore, about someone, having lost this or that because whatever, they had just accumulated a lot of debt on these platforms.
नूर मोहम्मद शाह ने तकरीबन 1 करोड़ से ज्यादा रकम हार दी है. ये शख्स गेम में करीबन 1.5 करोड़ रुपए हार चुके हैं.
तुमने खेला क्या ये? कितने पैसे गंवाए?
अभी मेरे ऊपर 96 लाख रुपए का कर्ज है.
कितने?
96
लाख रुपए का कर्ज है.
So yeah, that's what the government says is like one of the probably the biggest reason for them, that essentially what they're saying is that like in technical and legal terms, they view this as a public safety, public health risk, right? They feel that this is a net risk to like India's collective public health. With addiction issues, its impact on your mental state, etc. Of course, it's a potential impact on your financial state as well. So that, of course, is a big, big component of where the government is coming from. And then again, you have some national security concerns as well, where, you have concerns like, say, money laundering, you have concerns like, terror funding, etc. Like maybe terror communication also. Like there is this also belief that a lot of these apps, chat platforms are used by terrorists. Again, we don't know what the veracity of these beliefs are. But yeah, certainly like they seem to have acted on a lot of these anxieties that they seem to have.
And do we know how much money people were losing while playing these games? Do we know that?
So I think, again, the government, like unofficially, informally had said that more than 45 crore people were losing more than 20 to 30,000 crore rupees a year. And they saw happening sort of recurringly over the years, which, on a per person basis might not seem like a lot of money, but if you just divide the two. But yeah, I mean, certainly the cumulative figures seems kind of horrible.
And Soumyarendra, for a lot of people, this bill came as a complete surprise. There weren't a lot of murmurs leading up to it. Did it come as a surprise to the industry as well?
Oh yeah, the suddenness of the move. It actually caught the industry. It was the suddenness of the move, right? And this is an industry which more than, I think, the way that I have seen this industry always is that this is not primarily a gaming industry, but this is primarily a government affairs industry, right? I mean, lobbying was a big part of how they operated, lobbying primarily against each other in their interests, etc. It was an industry filled with sort of internal feuds. Of course, internal competition and in cross-industry competition exists everywhere. But I think the level of feud and the level of lobbying against each other that I sort of witnessed in this particular industry, I don't think it happens as openly and as brazenly in other industries, right? So they really thrived on this relationship that they managed to build with governments across, right? At the state level, at the central level, etc. Kind of anticipating, trying to mold public opinion, etc. So yeah, like when you have such powerful people working for you who sort of liaise on your behalf with the government, I think the government really wanted to keep this a secret, maybe because they were aware that, if they get a whiff of this, they might try and stall it in one way or the other by tapping into several channels that of course are available to them. So I guess, yeah, they wanted to keep it as secret as possible, move on this as quickly as possible. Those are also some of the murmurs that are coming out that this was a bill which was, written down very quickly, probably like in the IT ministry's history, one of the quickest bills to be ever written. And, the intent of it was very clear from the moment I think they started working on it, is that this is something that they want to get passed as soon as possible. And yeah, that's eventually what we saw happen. It got cabinet's approval on day one and it was passed in both the houses of parliament over the next couple of days, and then it got president's assent and it's now an act. And also it's probably the only act in India's history, I could be wrong, but I guess it's a fair assumption to make, is that, people were seen to be complying with it even before it became an act. So even before it sort of received president's assent, we saw like a bunch of companies release statements or just, notify on their apps that real money games are no longer available. So I guess this has to be definitely like one of the quickest to be complied with laws in India, more so even before it became law, right? So I think that shows you just how, I don't know, like hopeless maybe the industry feels, because I think they understand that this would be really difficult to lobby against now.
And so does this essentially mean the end for this sector then?
Exactly, it's over. We've seen on these apps, they are no longer offering online money games. And we were talking about the money that these companies were making. This was their only business model, right? I mean, it's not like there was something else going on. Like say for something like Dream11, for instance, of the close to 7,000 crore rupees it did in, I think, FY23, 95% of it came from online money gaming, right? So this was the business. And the act kind of, just hurts at the right place for them. So yeah, the sector as we know it, the companies as we've come to know them in the last few years, they are over. Of course, they're all trying to pivot, to get a makeover, to clean their image. I think Dream11 is launching like a new wealth management app called Dream Money, where they're planning to offer like, gold loans and things like that. Winzo, I think, is sort of piloting some short video content and short video creation, and is kind of reaching out to creators to kind of build like indigenous and like local language focused short video content, etc. So yeah, like they're all trying and exploring things which they've not done before, and which I don't know, like of course there is no alignment with what they were doing earlier, but the brand certainly means something. Dream11 is a name people recognize now. It had stickiness, like, close to, I think, 260 million users for Dream11. So yeah, I guess if they can maybe make use of some of the audience that was captive with them to kind of, make them shift to some of these platforms, and if they can figure out a way. And of course, like some companies will continue working on, say, creating games. Like Dream11 has a studio as well, where they're creating mobile-centric games right now, and they have a cricket game on the Play Store available. So I'm sure that work will keep going. But of course, that's not where the money was coming from. So yeah, the sector, as we know it, is over.
And are the industry players, are they planning to challenge this law in the courts?
So, I mean, it's a mixed bag of opinions at this point in time. I think Dream11 and some other companies, they've publicly said that, they no longer wish to challenge this because the act makes the government's sort of viewpoint on the sector very clear. And they feel that irrespective of what judgment might likely be, there is no point in doing a business which clearly will never find favor with the government anymore. And it's just difficult to operate in that kind of, when you have that kind of a relationship with the government. Although a rummy platform called A23, they have filed a case against the act in the Karnataka High Court. So yeah, that's the first challenge that's come in. So yeah, certainly we already have one challenge. I think the initial expectation was that there will be multiple challenges from the companies and maybe challenges from their industry associations, their lobby groups, etc. But that doesn't seem to happen. Like the legal challenges aren't coming the way that everyone was sort of expecting them. But yeah, certainly we have one challenge now.
Now, so far, we have talked about the online gaming industry and the details of this law that for now has brought it to a halt. But now, let's look at the effects that money-based games have on individuals and the resources available to address gambling addiction. An issue that, as it turns out, has a lot in common with other more widely recognized addictions. So to talk about this in detail, we are joined by the Indian Express's Anonna Dutt, who reports on health for the paper. Anonna, can you tell our listeners how do mental health professionals define gambling addiction?
So gambling addiction has to be something that's persistent. It's not a one-off gambling or, gambling a couple of times a year. That wouldn't constitute addiction. Addiction would be when gambling would significantly impact a person's life. So, for example, there would be some financial stress. There would be, fights in the family. There would be breakdown of relationships. There could be suicidal ideation because of debts, etc. And when it comes to the definition, the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's like a book that defines all mental disorders and how to diagnose them, calls it gambling disorder and defines it as a persistent, recurrent, problematic gambling behavior where people exhibit certain signs that would include, repetitive thoughts of gambling, need to gamble with increasing amounts of money, repeated unsuccessful attempts to quit gambling, being restless or irritable when they're not gambling, or chasing the big win even when they're losing money, using gambling to escape other problems, things like that. So you have to fulfill 4 of these several criteria to be diagnosed as having gambling disorder.
And this point about needing to gamble more and more and with more money, this kind of behavior we see in other forms of addiction as well, right? In drinking or smoking. But because they all come under this broad umbrella of addiction, can you talk about how does gambling addiction differ psychologically and physiologically from these other addictions?
So psychologically, actually, there are quite a few similarities. Like you mentioned, of course, chasing that next high is something that you would see also in gambling addicts. In fact, it used to be thought of as an impulse control disorder previously, but it has now been changed to an addictive disorder. And, they would also take risks similarly to people who have, issues with different substance abuse. They would jeopardize relationships. They might not maintain personal hygiene. These kinds of things are common with both gambling addicts as well as people who are addicted to certain substances. But there are certain differences with gambling addiction. So, for instance, substance abuse is very physical. You would see telltale signs of addiction. These visible signs you would not see with a gambling addict. Then again, there's also a very medical aspect to, say, a substance use disorder. So, for example, if you drink alcohol or if you're doing drugs, they directly impact your various organ systems. And, if you're drinking too much, you can have a liver damage and you will be hospitalized for that. You wouldn't see something like that with gambling. Also, some peculiar things with gambling is that there is some science to it, like you can calculate certain odds and you can make some educated guesses for gambling.
Right, obviously, because they're all games, they do require some kind of skill set.
Exactly. I mean, there's some element of calculation or some ways of mitigating risks, so to say. There are certain things that you can do, and it is something that habitual gamblers do often practice. Secondly, when it comes to substance abuse, actually the addicts don't think that there is a net positive to it. But with gambling, people do think there is a net positive and they can recoup all the money that they have lost. So it's like that chase of winning big, which keeps them going. So that is also very unique to gambling. But when we talk about this reward pathways in our brain, it's actually very similar to what you would see in people with substance use disorders as well.
And Anonna, do we have any idea about how many people in India suffer from this problem?
So there is no comprehensive estimate as such. We do not have a nationwide survey that can tell us how many gambling addicts there are. There is some nationwide survey about, substance use, but we do not have similar data for gambling. What we do have are these few studies that have been undertaken. Couple of studies from Kerala and one from Goa, which gives us some estimates of what the problem might be. And it suggests that about 7% of the people might have problematic gambling behavior, whereas many more might have actually gambled. So one study shows 19.5% have gambled in their lifetime. The other one shows 27.9% have. And the one from Goa actually says half of the people had gambled in the past 1 year. But that doesn't essentially mean that they have gambling addiction. Gambling addiction or problematic gambling was only in about 7% of the people.
And is there a certain kind of person who's more susceptible to gambling addiction?
Yes, so it has been found largely it's young men who are very susceptible to gambling disorders. Single men, especially men who are living alone, are at a higher risk, or if they have been married for less than 5 years, they are at a higher risk of gambling disorders. People who have not had a good education or are struggling financially or have any other stressful event in their life, they are also much more likely to get into gambling. And almost all of the people who do end up gambling also have other psychological disorders, like it could be substance use or impulse control disorders or mood disorders, anxiety disorders, some sort of other clinical manifestation as well.
And another big part of gambling, of course, is the financial ruin that people end up facing, right? There are so many that go under debt, and that is something that affects families a lot.
Yes, so in fact, there is a study from Australia which showed that 4.2% of all their suicides were gambling related. So it is also one of the drivers of suicidal ideation and suicides. Other than that, it can also disrupt the family in, non-monetary ways. So because someone is busy gambling, it kind of disrupts the entire schedule of the family. It also, ends up leaving, say, the partner in charge of some legal and, other financial problems that might arise out of it. Children in the household, if it's like the father or the mother who's gambling, then they feel that loss. They feel that absence of parenting. They also end up having a lot of trust and reliability issues. And sometimes they end up being the parents in that situation. So these are the things that you would see in a family situation, other than, of course, the financial ruin that happens.
And in India, of course, like many other places, gambling is very regulated, right? There are only certain places, for example, where you can physically go. And Goa, for example, is one of them. But otherwise, earlier when someone had to gamble, they would go to a club or a casino or someone's house, and, it would happen in these sort of informal places. But how much have these online platforms changed things?
So in fact, experts do believe that there might be more gambling disorder. It might be on the rise because of these online platforms, simply because it just increases the accessibility. And in a lot of places, like in India also till very recently, it was legal. So there's also a social acceptability to it, which means that children were getting on these platforms, young adults were getting on these platforms, and sometimes it's within gameplay that you have to bet. So these sort of things made it very commonplace, very socially acceptable to do it. So there is this sense that this would lead to a lot of problematic gambling. Right now, we do not have very concrete data to show that, but experts believe that it is going up, especially in, say, the early 20s is when they're facing a lot of problems.
And now, of course, these companies have been banned. But something that you would see in their ads was that they would promise people lakhs of rupees, a vacation, a new car. So could you talk about just the kind of marketing tools these companies use to get people hooked onto them?
So one reason, as I said, why it might be increasing is just the simple accessibility. You have your phone on you all the time. The apps would give you, say, notifications, or like you mentioned, they would have these ads within if you open some other app, right? So it's just so easy to log into these things. And when you start off, the bets are small. So it kind of starts getting people hooked onto the platforms. Then their ease of use, flashy platform, that again, of course, helps. And especially people have been pointing out this in-game betting. So this actually reduces the time between you betting and getting a reward to just a few minutes to even say maximums a few hours. And that sort of reward pathway means that you keep going back for more. That gets you more hooked onto the platform. That is one specific problem that the experts have highlighted. And other than that, there's also this targeted, advertising. So you can be on an Instagram or on Twitter and you would get these ads. They know who would log into the app and they would market it to you. There's also huge celebrity endorsements. So there was, of course, Dream 11, which had, Shah Rukh Khan or all these cricket players coming on and doing the advertisements. So that also sort of brings people on the platform. And again, another point with online is that with traditional gambling, as you mentioned, you had to go to a place. You had to, sort of put in your bets, wait for it to happen. This just makes it so much faster and accessible just because it's on the phone.
And could you talk about what kind of resources one can access to deal with this problem, to deal with gambling addiction?
So, if someone suspects and if your family members say that you might have a problem, then it's a good idea to go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. There is usually a psychiatry department in every district and tertiary care hospital. And in fact, the government is now working on expanding this network to, say, reach even the PHC level through its mental health program. You can access there. You can access in any of your neighboring clinics, of course. Other than that, there is also a Nasha Mukt helpline that the government has, which is 14446. And there is a mental health helpline that the government runs called Telemanas, which also people can call, which is 1-800-89-14416. So these are two government helplines that people can reach out to, and they usually have psychologists on the call and they counsel the people. And you can, in fact, keep following up with them, or they will refer you to your nearest government center where you can go and have an in-person conversation after that first initial call.
And the other thing is that sometimes it can be very hard to know whether someone has a gambling problem, right? Because when you're doing it on your phone or your computer, you have much more privacy. You're not going to a physical space, for example. So what are some of the early signs that family members can keep an eye out for? And what about the person themselves recognizing that this is an actual problem?
So as I mentioned, there's not really a lot of outward signs that people can actually look out for. Yes, of course, somebody jostling for their phone and wanting to go check what happened with their bet. That is the best way that family members can spot. And of course, sudden draining of finances, etc., that would be a red flag. As for the person themselves, they can sort of start putting limits to how much they can gamble or the time they would spend, because it's not simply about the money. It's also a lot of time that you're spending on these platforms. So you can set a limit on all of this and see whether you're okay with that or whether you're jostling go ahead, move beyond your limit. And that's a good indication whether it's just gambling casually or is it something that you're addicted to now. But other than that, of course, everything that I mentioned earlier, needing to gamble with increasing amounts of money, trying to control but not able to control, getting restless when they are actually not going on the platforms, losing money and then still going on the platforms, lying to family members, risking relationships, and also is sometimes, you're doing forgery or fraud, etc. People do that. So those are the actual things that people have to watch out for.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.